Imagine an old photograph of a harbor. The year is 1883. Ships are lined up side by side. The water is quiet, like glass. But something is wrong. There is no smoke, no black clouds from coal, no mountain of fuel on the pier. These were supposed to be the dirty days of steam and soot. But this harbor looks like it was painted for another world. This is one of the harbors of Tartaria, 1883. How the tides drove the invisible engines of the empire. Places where, officially, steam engines powered everything. But under the stone, completely different engines were hiding. Beneath the clean embankments are strange chambers. Under the water, tunnels and gates that look less like drains and more like valves. The tide comes in, the water pushes against the walls, and something in the depths begins to work. No fire, no noise. The building plans disappear. Journals suddenly stop writing about water pressure. Old channels are filled with concrete, and historians say, that's how it should be. It was just an old style. But what if not? What if the tides really did drive the invisible engines of an entire empire, and someone deliberately erased this system from our history? If they already knew how to power harbors without coal, then who had so much to gain by making sure we forgot? When I first began researching industrial ports of the 1880s, I expected soot. I expected mountains of coal stacked like black pyramids along every waterfront. I expected chimneys, steam clouds, the grime of empire stamped across every stone. That illusion collapsed the moment I opened a glass plate photograph from 1883. It showed a harbor at dusk, dozens of ships packed tight, their masts like a forest of bone against the fading light. The water sat perfectly still, mirror smooth, reflecting the holes in flawless symmetry. But there was no smoke, no coal piles, no smudge of industry anywhere in the frame, just clean stone, arched vaults along the quay, heavy iron doors set at water level, their edges sharp and deliberate, like the seals of something engineered, and walls, pristine walls that looked as if they had never touched fire. I stared at that photo for an hour, feeling my idea of the industrial age begin to crack. Because if this was the age of coal, if steam ruled every port from London to the Black Sea, then why does this harbor look like it never burned anything at all? The deeper I went into the records, the stranger it became. I found blueprints, old dock plans from the same decade, archived in municipal basements and forgotten engineering libraries. They showed basins, gates, canals, tunnels, but almost no space for the boilers you would expect, no massive coal sheds, no chimneys drawn into the structure. Instead, the plans marked large chambers beneath the quays, rooms labeled only as water enclosures or tidal wells. Vague, functional, as if the engineers assumed whoever read these plans already understood what they were for and did not need the details written out. I layered one blueprint over the 1883 photograph, matching the dock to the drawing. Those mystery chambers sat directly beneath the clean stone walls, right where the tide would press hardest, like lungs pressed by each incoming wave. That was the moment the story turned. Because I started looking at other harbors, London, Hamburg, Antwerp, Trieste, all major ports, all built in roughly the same years, and every single one had the same strange features. Vaults near the waterline, spotless and vast, like ribs of ancient temples. Stone terraces that stepped down in perfect rhythm with the tidal range. Gates that did not look like simple doors. No, they looked like valves, massive, mechanical, built to hold pressure, not just keep water out. Slowly, a pattern formed. These were not random design choices. These harbors were built in tidal zones, strong tidal zones, places where the sea did not just lap gently at the shore, but surged twice a day with the slow, unstoppable force of a breathing giant. Ask yourself, why build your empire's most important ports in the hardest places to dock, unless the tide itself was part of the plan? I found journals, harbor logs from the 1870s and 1880s, mentions of strong pulses beneath the piers at certain hours, of rumbles under the stone when no ships were moving, of cranes that somehow lifted cargo during high water with no visible engine nearby. One engineer's diary, dated 1881, described a dock in the Baltic as having chambers that breathe with the sea. Another called a harbor's underbelly, a hydraulic network of unmatched elegance. But when I searched for their full reports, for the technical breakdowns of how these systems worked, The documents were gone, filed under obsolete, marked as lost in renovation, or simply not cataloged at all, as if they had slipped between the shelves on purpose. It is as if someone decided we did not need to remember. So here is where we stand. One photograph, one set of blueprints, a dozen harbors across Europe that all share the same impossible cleanliness, the same hidden chambers, the same intimate relationship with the tide. And the more I looked, the more I realized. Maybe the real engines of this empire were never on the ships. Maybe they were under the water all along. That realization shook me. Because if I am right, if these harbors were designed to harness tidal pressure, to turn the rhythm of the sea into mechanical power without fire, without coal, without the supply chains that fed every other industrial system, then someone erased it, deliberately, completely. And they did it so well that we forgot it was ever possible. If you are still here, if you are feeling that same spark I felt when I first saw that smokeless harbor, subscribe, not for the algorithm, for what comes next. Because this is just the beginning. The tide is about to reveal something far bigger than one clean dock, something that changes how we see the entire industrial age. Let's go deeper. The first blueprint I found sat in a cardboard box marked Municipal Works, obsolete. The paper had gone yellow at the edges, but the ink was still sharp. Clean lines, precise measurements, the kind of careful engineering that makes you feel you can trust every number on the page. But something was missing. I spread it across my desk next to 3 other harbor plans from the same era. Different cities, different architects, but all from that narrow window between 1875 and 1885. Then I started comparing. A normal industrial dock from that period should show certain things. You would expect the footprint of a boiler house, usually marked near the center of operations. Coal storage, always massive, always close to the water for easy unloading. Engine rooms with room for flywheels, pistons, the whole mechanical gut of steam power. Chimneys drawn as circles on the roof plans, their height noted in the margins like exclamation points of industry. These blueprints had none of that. What they did have were chambers, huge chambers, rooms carved into the foundation of the quay itself, sitting below the waterline, their walls drawn thick, 2 feet, sometimes 3 feet. And these chambers were connected. Tunnels ran between them like veins, each one carefully angled, each one marked with arrows showing direction of flow. Flow of what? The labels gave almost nothing away. Tidal enclosure, pressure gate, hydraulic reserve. One plan, from a harbor in the Netherlands, simply wrote engine chamber beneath a massive vault, but drew no engine inside it, no boilers, no pistons. Just empty space where the heart of the system should have been. I sat back, stared at the ceiling, and tried to make sense of it. If you are designing a dock and you need power to run cranes, to pump water, to move cargo, you need an engine. That is the rule. Steam ruled the world in 1883. Every textbook says so. But these plans seem to assume the power was already there, built into the stone, like the dock itself was the machine. And then I noticed something else. On every single blueprint, those mystery chambers aligned with something very specific. The high water mark. The architects had drawn thin dotted lines showing where the tide would reach at its peak, and every single hydraulic reserve, every sealed vault, every pressure gate sat exactly at that line, or just below it. They were not designing around the tide. They were designing for it. I pulled out a map of tidal ranges across Europe. The difference between low and high tide in some of these ports was enormous. 15 feet, 20 feet, in some cases even more. That is millions of gallons of water moving in and out twice a day, pressing against stone, filling basins, draining through channels. That is force, constant, predictable, free force. The deeper I went into these plans, the more I realized they were not just managing that force. They were capturing it. Imagine this. The tide comes in. Water floods through the main gates into the outer basin. As it rises, it fills those deep chambers beneath the quay, pushing air out through vents, compressing whatever is inside. The gates close at the peak, not to keep water out, but to trap it in. Now you have pressure, contained pressure. Pressure that could drive a piston, turn a wheel, lift a weight. The tide does not need coal, It does not need a firebox or an engineer shoveling fuel. It just needs stone, iron, and gravity. I found a patent file from 1879, buried in a database that almost nobody searches anymore. It described a hydraulic accumulator for maritime use, essentially a giant chamber that stored tidal pressure and released it slowly to power machinery. The inventor called it a system requiring no combustion and no imported energy. The patent was filed, approved, and then never mentioned again. No factories picked it up. No journals wrote about it. It just disappeared into the archive, like it had been quietly folded shut and pushed to the back of a shelf. But here is the strangest part. When I cross-referenced the inventor's name with construction records, I found his signature on the plans for 4 major European harbors, all built in the early 1880s, all featuring those same sealed chambers, those same pressure gates, those same cryptic labels. He knew. He built it. And then the record goes silent. Why? Why would a working system, one that required no fuel, no supply chains, no dependence on coal shipments from distant mines, simply vanish from history? I started looking for demolition records, for reports of those chambers being filled in, sealed off, repurposed, and I found them. Dozens of them. Most dated to the late 1880s and early 1890s. The language was always the same: modernization, safety improvements, conversion to standard industrial practice. Standard meant steam. Standard meant coal. Standard meant control. Because when you look at who funded those demolitions, who pushed the new regulations, who wrote the safety codes that suddenly declared tidal chambers unsafe or inefficient, you keep seeing the same names: coal companies, steam engine manufacturers, shipping cartels that profited from every ton of fuel moving through those very harbors. It was not progress that killed the tidal harbors. It was competition. Once you see it in one harbor, you cannot unsee it in the others. I started pulling every photograph I could find from the 1880s. Port archives, municipal collections, old shipping company records that had been digitized and then forgotten. I was no longer interested in famous shots or postcard views. I was hunting for details, the corners of images, the backgrounds, the things photographers never meant to capture, and the pattern kept repeating. London's Royal Docks, a photograph from 1882. 3-masted ships lined up like soldiers, their reflections perfect in still water. But zoom into the quay wall behind them, there is no soot, no black staining from coal smoke, just pale stone, clean as the day it was cut, with a series of arched openings at water level. Not windows, not doors for cargo, something else. Hamburg, 1884, a glass plate image of the Speicherstadt during construction. You can see the workers, tiny figures on scaffolding, but you can also see what they are building: massive vaults beneath the warehouse district, each one opening directly onto the canal. The architecture looks almost religious, ribbed ceilings, Gothic precision, but it sits right at the waterline, where tide and stone meet twice a day. Antwerp, Trieste, Marseille, Rotterdam, same decade, same features, the same impossible cleanliness for an age that should have been drowning in industrial grime. I made a list. 17 major ports across Europe, all built or heavily renovated between 1875 and 1885, all located in zones with a strong tidal range. Not calm bays or simple river harbors, but places where the sea moved with force, with rhythm, with power you could measure. And all of them had those chambers. Some were hidden better than others. In Trieste, they were disguised as drainage cisterns. In Liverpool, they were marked on old maps as pump reserves. But the design was always the same: deep stone vaults positioned precisely where the tide would press hardest, connected by channels that followed the natural flow of water, sealed with gates that looked far too engineered to be simple flood barriers. I started comparing them to modern tidal power stations, the few that exist today. The design principles were nearly identical. Capture the incoming tide, store the pressure, release it in controlled bursts to drive machinery. The only difference was that the modern ones admit what they are doing. The versions from the 1880s hid it in plain sight. I found a travel journal from 1881, written by a British engineer touring continental ports. He described the docks of Trieste as a marvel of hidden automation. He wrote about cranes that moved cargo with uncanny smoothness, as if the quay itself were alive. He mentioned watching a massive iron gate close at high tide and hearing, from somewhere deep beneath the stone, a low mechanical hum that lasted for hours. It was as if the harbor had a heartbeat, he wrote. But when I looked for his technical report, the one he promised to publish about these systems, it was gone. The journal survived. The report did not. Ask yourself, how many engineers saw these harbors and understood exactly what they were looking at? How many wrote about them, sketched them, tried to explain them to colleagues back home? And how much of that record simply disappeared? I started cross-referencing the dates. When were these photographs taken? When were the harbors modernized? When did the old plans get filed under obsolete and the new coal-powered docks take over? The timeline was shockingly tight. Most of these clean, mysterious harbors were functioning perfectly well through the early 1880s. Then, between 1885 and 1895, almost all of them underwent major reconstruction. Chambers were filled with rubble. Gates were removed or bricked over. The stonework was covered with new industrial facades, iron sheds, coal conveyors, the visual language of steam. The official reason was always progress. Outdated systems, insufficient capacity. Modern demands require modern solutions. But the strangest part was this. Many of these harbors became smaller after the renovations, fewer functional basins, less cargo capacity, more infrastructure dedicated to storing and burning coal than to actually moving goods. It was not an upgrade, it was a conversion from one type of power to another, from free and tidal to purchased and controlled. I found a newspaper clipping from Hamburg, 1889. A small article buried on page 7. It mentioned resistance from old dock workers to the new steam cranes being installed. One worker was quoted saying the old system needed no coal and made no smoke, and worked better besides. The article dismissed him as nostalgic, backwards, clinging to the past. But what if he was just telling the truth? The more I studied these photographs, these spotless harbors that should not exist in the coal-choked 1880s, the more I realized this was not a coincidence. This was not about a few eccentric engineers building unusual docks. This was a network, a system, something that connected ports across an entire region, all built on the same principle, all erased in the same decade. And someone really wanted us to forget it existed. I needed to understand the tide itself, not as scenery, not as something ships simply waited for, but as fuel. Because if I was right, if these harbors were truly machines designed to capture tidal force, then I had to think like the engineers who built them. I needed to see the ocean the way they did. So I went back to basics. The tide exists because of the moon's gravity pulling on Earth's oceans. Twice a day the sea rises, twice a day it falls. In some places, this change is barely noticeable. A few inches, maybe a foot. But in the ports I was studying, the tidal range was immense. 10 feet, 15. In the Bay of Fundy, more than 50. That is not just water moving. That is energy. Enormous, relentless, predictable energy. Think of it this way. Imagine a giant lung breathing in and out, twice a day, every day forever. Now imagine a machine that sits in the path of that breath and captures it, stores it, uses it. That, I began to realize, was what these harbors were. In an engineering manual from 1876, written for harbor construction, I found a section titled Tidal Hydraulics. It explained how to calculate the pressure of rising water, how to design chambers to withstand it, how to build gates that sealed at the exact moment to trap maximum force. The mathematics were elegant, precise, confident, the kind of thinking that comes from long experience, not from early experiments. And that was what struck me most. The manual did not treat this as innovation. It treated it as routine, as if every competent harbor engineer already knew how to use tidal power. The text assumed understanding. It offered formulas, not explanations, which means this technology was not new in 1876. It was established, proven. So, how far back did it go? I started finding older traces. An account from the 1850s described Bristol docks powered by pressure engines driven by maritime force. A Dutch canal engineer in the 1820s mentioned water batteries that charge with the sea's rhythm. Rough sketches followed, Chambers, gates, wheels turned by captured tide. This knowledge was not modern. It was inherited. Then I found something that made me stop cold. A maintenance log from a Baltic harbor, dated 1879. Routine notes, gate inspections, stoneware, until one line, underlined twice. Rumbling in Chamber 3 continues at peak flow. Workers report vibration through floor stones during evening tide. No visible damage. System functions as designed. System functions as designed. They expected the rumbling. They expected the vibration. This was not a flaw. It was the harbor doing exactly what it was built to do. I began looking for more evidence like it, and I found it, scattered across reports and letters, hidden in dry technical language, trying hard not to sound strange. Acoustic phenomena during tidal exchange. Mechanical. Resonance in sub-key structures. Pressure release events coinciding with lunar cycle. A report from Antwerp in 1883 noted that dock workers began timing shifts with the tide because certain machinery operates with greater efficiency during the 6 hours of tidal rise. Certain machinery, not steam-powered, not coal-fed, just machinery. Machines that worked better when the tide was rising, when the chambers were filling, when pressure was building, when the harbor had fuel. I pulled up modern tidal charts and overlaid them with old harbor schedules. The alignment was perfect. Cranes operated during the rising tide. Heavy cargo was moved around high water. Night work matched the second tide of the day. They were working with the rhythm of the moon. And then another detail clicked. The mystery harbors, the ones that stayed impossibly clean, were almost always built at river mouths or in narrow channels, places where the tide did not just rise and fall, but also rushed and compressed. That is the key to tidal power. You do not only need height, you need motion, flow, pressure. The engineers of that era had chosen their sites with surgical precision. They were not just building docks, they were building instruments, machines tuned to the pulse of the sea, harvesting its power every 12 hours. I found a letter from a French hydraulic engineer to a German colleague, dated 1880. He described visiting a new harbor in the Netherlands and being astounded by the efficiency of the tidal apparatus, which provides continuous power to 12 separate mechanisms without a single furnace required. Continuous power, no furnaces? He was not describing a dream. He was describing what he had witnessed. But when I looked for his later work, papers, designs, lectures, nothing remained. 3 years later, his next publication discussed steam pressure in coal-fired systems. It was as if someone had told him to stop. The conclusion became impossible to ignore. These harbors were not primitive. They were advanced, precise machines that used free, endless energy from the sea itself. And at some point, someone decided we should forget that was ever possible. I started pinning things to my wall: photographs, blueprints, maps, newspaper clippings, timelines written on index cards. In the end, it looked like the investigation board from a detective film, strings connecting one piece of evidence to another. But this was no murder case. It felt bigger than that. Because when I stepped back and looked at everything together, a pattern emerged that I could not see while I was buried in single harbors. This was not the story of one brilliant engineer in one city. It was coordinated, connected. A system that stretched across an entire region and very likely beyond it. The dates aligned almost too perfectly. Between 1875 and 1885, 17 major ports went through huge buildings. Campaigns, not light updates to old medieval docks, but complete rebuilds from the foundation up. New stone blocks, new vaults, new hydraulic gates, all using the same architectural language, the same engineering logic, the same careful siting, in zones with strong tides. It was like watching a network switch on. I mapped them, drew lines between cities based on shipping routes, canal links, shared contractors. The pattern on the map looked almost biological, like a nervous system along the coastline. Large nodes at Hamburg, Antwerp, Trieste, smaller nodes feeding into them through rivers and narrow channels. And then there was the stonework. That was the detail that really fixed the idea in my mind. I began comparing close-up photographs of quay walls from different ports, the same tool marks on the blocks, the same curve of the arches, the same type of iron fittings on the gates. This was not random. This was standardization. Someone had designed a system, a template, and then rolled it out across Europe in the space of a single decade. In a few contracts, I found a brief mention of a Commission for Maritime Infrastructure operating between 1873 and 1884. It appeared in exactly 3 documents I could locate. No list of members, no clear charter, just short notes in the margins of construction deals, always naming it as the supervising authority. Who were they supervising? And on whose orders? The firms that physically built the harbors were mostly regional, local stonemasons, local engineering offices. But they all cited the same technical standards. They all referred to the same approved methods for building tidal chambers. Approved by whom? One manifest from a shipping company in 1882 listed ports by their hydraulic capacity, a rating that measured how much tidal force each harbor could capture. The list ran from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Every city scored on a scale I did not yet understand, but which clearly mattered to the people who used it. They were comparing these harbors the way we compare power plants today, by output, by efficiency. This was infrastructure, energy infrastructure, a grid built on water instead of wires. Then I found the engineer's note that changed everything. It was tucked into the back of a leather journal I had picked up at an estate sale, one of those mixed boxes nobody bothers to check page by page. The journal belonged to a Scottish civil engineer named Robert McFarlane, who had worked on dock projects across Europe in the 1870s and 1880s. Most of his entries were dry, technical, measurements, material lists, budget worries. But on a page dated March of 1882, he wrote something entirely different. Visited the works at Trieste, spoke with Herr Vogler about the integration concerns. He assures me the resonance patterns have been tested and the coastal nodes will synchronize once the Adriatic gates are completed. I confess I remain skeptical that such harmony is achievable across distances so vast, but the mathematics are sound. If it works as designed, we will have achieved what the ancients only dreamed of, a city-state sustained by the breath of the sea alone. I read that passage 20 times. Resonance patterns, coastal nodes, synchronization. He was not talking about a single harbor. He was talking about harbors working together, coordinating, operating as parts of one larger machine. And then, that last line, what the ancients only dreamed of. Which ancients? Which dreams? McFarlane never explained. His next entry, 2 months later, slipped back into routine inspection notes. He never named Herr Vogler again. He never returned to the idea of synchronized harbors. But that phrase stayed with me. It suggested this was not even a new idea to them. It was something old, something they were rebuilding, restoring, or finally bringing to full scale. I went back to the maps, measured the distances between these key ports, calculated how long a tidal pulse would take to travel along the coast from one to the next. The numbers were eerie. Trigger a pressure release in Hamburg at high tide, and the wave would reach Rotterdam just as its own tide peaked. Time the gates at Trieste correctly, and the effect could ripple up the Adriatic in a controlled cascade. They could have been talking through the water itself, using the tide as a signal, a clock, a shared pulse that kept the entire system in rhythm. I know how that sounds. It feels almost too organized, too precise, too close to a conspiracy. But I am only following what the evidence shows. 17 harbors, the same decade, the same design logic, the same tidal calculations, the same sealed chambers, the same careful placement along coasts where water moves with real force. And then, within roughly 10 years, almost all of them were dismantled, filled in, covered, replaced by coal-burning steam systems that were loud, dirty, expensive, and forever hungry for fuel from faraway mines. Why would you abandon free energy for purchased energy? Unless someone needed you to. I stopped calling them harbors in my notes. They were nodes now, points on a map that only made sense when you saw them together. The more I traced construction dates, shipping routes, and architectural signatures, the more it looked like someone had designed this from above. Not piecemeal, not city by city, but as a single continental system. I spread a map of Europe across my desk, marked every port with those distinctive tidal chambers, drew lines between them along canal networks, coastal shipping lanes, river connections. The picture that emerged was not random. It was a grid. The major nodes sat at precise intervals, places where trade routes converged, where rivers met the sea, where tidal forces were strongest. Hamburg, Antwerp, Rotterdam, Trieste, each one positioned like a heart with smaller ports branching off like arteries. And the timing. That was the part I could not ignore. These structures were not built over centuries. They appeared in less than 15 years, between roughly 1870 and 1885. Different countries, different governments, different languages, yet all of them followed the same blueprint, the same hydraulic logic, the same intimate relationship with the tide. Someone was coordinating this. In a customs record from 1878, I found a shipment of special maritime materials sent from a foundry in Prussia to 6 different European ports. The cargo list named iron gates of unusual specification and pressure-rated stone fittings. Every order was placed by the same entity, written only as CMI, the Commission for Maritime Infrastructure. I had already seen in other files. I began hunting for more traces of this commission. Its name surfaced in construction contracts, payment ledgers, engineering certificates, always in the background, never signing the front page, just supervising, approving, making sure standards were followed. Then, in 1884, the trail stopped. No more mentions. The commission simply vanished from the paperwork. I turned to what these ports actually did when they were running. Moving cargo was the obvious job. I wanted to know what set them apart from ordinary steam-powered docks. The answers were buried in the details. A shipping log from Antwerp dated 1882. Night operations conducted at full capacity despite no coal delivery this week. Cranes operated continuously during high water periods. 0 fuel costs recorded. A Port Authority report from Hamburg, 1883. Hydraulic systems maintained consistent pressure for 17 consecutive days following tidal optimization. Recommend expanding chamber network to Eastern Basin. Chamber network, they had a name for it. A financial audit from Trieste, 1881, compared operating expenses between the older steam section of the harbor and the new hydraulic district. The hydraulic side ran at 1/8 of the cost. No coal purchases, no boiler maintenance, only regular inspections of stonework and gate mechanisms. It was devastatingly efficient. Then I found the word I had been avoiding, a word loaded with so much baggage that most serious researchers refused to touch it. Tartaria. In a French trade journal from 1879, an article discussed modern hydraulic engineering techniques inherited from Tartarian hydraulic science. The author, an engineer named Beaumont, described visiting several ports and being shown ancient principles of water pressure management that had been recently rediscovered and adapted for industrial use. He did not treat Tartaria as a myth or a secret empire. He mentioned it the way you would cite Rome or Byzantium, as a historical source of older knowledge now being reused. Other references appeared in scattered places. A German engineering text briefly mentioned Tartarian pressure gates in a chapter on tidal mechanics. A Dutch canal builder's memoir described adapting old methods from the eastern trade routes for modern harbor works. They were not talking about legend. They were talking about inherited technology, techniques that came from somewhere older and were being revived. What stopped me cold was the geography. The regions where these tidal harbors clustered, the Baltic coast, the approaches to the Black Sea, the northern Adriatic, matched the very zones that older maps labeled as Tartary, areas that official history now describes as sparse, marginal, empty. Yet engineers in the 1870s were finding advanced hydraulic ideas in those same places, ideas refined enough to power industrial harbors with no need for fire. I pulled out pre-1850 maps, drawn before borders were tidied up and names standardized. Across Eurasia, the labels stretched wide. Tartary, Tartaria, Tartaria, different spellings, same vast territory. Not blank, not featureless, just vague. As if mapmakers knew something was there but could not agree what to call it. And scattered across that region, in old city engravings and travelers' sketches, the same motifs repeated: arched waterways, stepped basins, intricate canal webs. The same stone and water language I had been tracking in the harbors of the 1880s. It began to feel as if those modern harbors were not inventions at all. They were reconstructions. A letter from an engineer in Königsberg to a colleague in Berlin, dated 1876, pushed that idea further. He described building new dock foundations and discovering older works beneath the harbor floor, channels and chambers of excellent design, far superior to our modern efforts. We have elected to preserve and incorporate them rather than demolish. They were not just inspired by an older system, they were literally building on top of it. The conclusion grows difficult to dismiss. What if the Tartarian system was not fantasy, but simply a name, maybe not even the correct one, for a maritime infrastructure network that once linked these coasts? A network that used tidal power instead of combustion. A network that left behind stone, chambers, and design rules that outlived the culture that built them. And what if, in the 1870s, someone decided to switch it back on, to rebuild it, modernize it, create an energy grid that did not depend on coal, did not enrich fuel barons, did not rely on constant imports controlled by someone else? That would explain the coordination, the speed, the shared design language. They were not inventing something new. They were remembering something old. I needed to see inside these chambers, not just as ink on blueprints, not just as shapes in my imagination. I needed to understand how the machine actually worked. So I began with what still exists. There is a tidal mill in Brittany that has been running, in one form or another, since the 1700s. It is a tourist site now, carefully preserved, but the mechanism still functions. I went there, watched the tide roll in along the channel, watched the heavy wooden gates swing shut, watched the trapped water keep a wheel turning for hours after the sea outside had already started to fall. The principle is simple, elegant, almost invisible if you are not looking for it. The tide enters through a narrow passage. As it rises, it fills a basin behind a gate. When the water reaches its peak, the gate closes, not to keep water out, but to keep it in. Now you have a reservoir, a kind of battery. And as the ocean outside begins to drop, a difference in height appears. Difference in height means pressure. Pressure means energy. You open a smaller gate. Let the captured water flow out slowly. That flow turns a wheel. The wheel drives a shaft. The shaft moves whatever you attach to it. A millstone, a pump, a crane. No fire, no fuel, just gravity and timing. Now, scale that logic up. Make the basin enormous, harbor-sized. Add multiple chambers at different levels so you can catch water at various tide heights. Link them with tunnels so pressure can be transferred, stored, and released in sequence. Fit them with gates precise enough to control the flow to the minute. That, I began to believe, was what these harbors were. In a Hamburg archive, I found a technical drawing from 1881, filed under Experimental Dock Machinery. It showed a cross-section of a quay wall with 3 chambers stacked vertically beneath it. Each chamber had intake gates facing the open water and outlet channels running back under the streets into the city. The notes described it as a cascade pressure system. As the tide filled the top chamber, it would overflow into the middle one, which in turn would overflow into the lowest. Each level stored water at a different pressure. Each could be tapped on its own, depending on how much force you needed. It was a hydraulic battery with 3 cells. The drawing showed the outlets feeding cranes, pumps, and something labeled only as distribution main, a thick pipe running beneath the roadway. I followed references to similar distribution, mains in other port records, and found them again and again. Underground channels, often misidentified as sewers or simple drainage, running from the harbor deep into the urban core. They were power lines, hydraulic power lines. There is a documented system like this in London, the London Hydraulic Power Company, which operated from 1883 to 1977. It used high-pressure water to power elevators, dockside cranes, even theater stages, across the city. The official story says the pressure came from steam-driven pumps. But when I examined the earliest installation plans, the pressure stations were clustered around the Thames docks, right in the tidal zones. And beneath the oldest stations were those same kinds of chambers, structures that predated the company's founding, structures the company claimed to have repurposed. What if they did not invent hydraulic power distribution at all? What if they inherited a tidal system that was already there and slowly swapped its natural engine for steam pumps? I traced similar networks in Antwerp, in Hamburg, in Marseille, all officially credited to steam power, all built on top of harbors with those distinctive tidal chambers, all dating their modernization to the late 1880s, exactly when the older tide-driven works were being removed or filled. The pattern was the same every time, inheritance disguised as invention. I began sketching how such a system would operate. The tide comes in twice a day. Each surge fills the chambers, building pressure. Gates close in a set order, trapping water at different heights. Through the day, that stored pressure drives machinery across the docks and out into the city via those buried mains. As the pressure falls, you simply wait for the next tide, roughly 12 hours later, to recharge the system. It is not truly continuous power, but it is predictable, cyclic, renewable, free, and if you built a chain of these harbors along a coastline, each one tuned to the same tidal rhythm, you would have a distributed power grid that never needed a single lump of fuel. That realization shook me, because this was not some crude, half-formed idea. It was careful systems engineering, the kind of thinking that plans decades ahead, that treats infrastructure as something that breathes with natural cycles instead of fighting them. The kind of thinking we claim to be innovating now with modern tidal projects. They already had it by the early 1880s, and then it was gone. They did not manage to erase everyone. Some voices survived, fragments, engineers who wrote in half-coded language, harbor masters who kept private journals, travelers who saw something they could not quite explain and wrote it down anyway. I started hunting for these voices, the people who knew, even if they did not fully understand what they were part of. The first one I found was a man named Pyotr Alexeyevich Kovalevsky, Russian, a hydraulic engineer who worked on port projects around the Baltic and the Black Sea in the 1870s. His official publications are exactly what you would expect: dry technical texts on dock construction, water levels, retaining walls, all the respectable parts of engineering. But he kept a diary. I found excerpts published in a regional historical journal in 1992, translated from Russian. Most of it was mundane: daily routines, weather, complaints, arguments with officials. And then there was an entry from July 1878, written while he was supervising work at a port near Odessa. The old channels beneath the foundation stones are far more sophisticated than anything we could design today. They branch like the roots of a tree, each one angled to catch pressure from a different phase of the tide. Grigori insists we fill them and start fresh, but I convinced him to preserve the main arteries. Our new work is merely decoration on bones that have held this harbor together for longer than anyone admits. Bones that have held this harbor together for longer than anyone admits. He did not say how long. He did not guess who built them. He simply admitted they were there, older, better, and already doing the job. Another voice appeared in a letter archived in Trieste. It was written in 1881 by an Italian engineer named Lorenzo Fabri to a colleague in Venice. He described walking through the newly completed tidal chambers beneath the quay and feeling as though we have not built something new, but rather awakened something that was always sleeping beneath us. He wrote about gates that close with uncanny precision at the peak moment, as if remembering their purpose, and stone that bears the marks of older tools, older hands. His letters stop in 1884. No explanation, no final note, just silence in the record. Then there was a British surveyor named Thomas Whitmore, who documented harbors for insurance companies. His work sounds painfully boring: measure depths, check cracks, assess structural risk. But in his 1882 report on Antwerp, buried in the technical appendices, he wrote, "The hydraulic reserves exhibit longevity inconsistent with stated construction date. Stonework shows weathering patterns suggesting exposure to tidal forces for significantly longer period than 7 years. Recommend revision of historical records or further investigation of foundation chronology." In careful insurance language, he was saying, these chambers are older than the paperwork claims. I found travel journals too. A German merchant who visited Hamburg in 1880 and wrote about hearing the breathing of the docks at night, a low, steady pulse that rose and fell with the tide. A French journalist who toured Rotterdam in 1883 and described cranes moving cargo with a fluid grace that seemed powered by the sea itself rather than any engine I could see. These were not specialists. They were ordinary observers who noticed something strange and described it honestly, without knowing what they were witnessing. And then there were the workers, the people who actually ran these systems. Dock hands, crane operators, gatekeepers who lived by the tide tables. Most of them left no neat written record, but every once in a while, someone interviewed them. In a labor report from Bremen, dated 1889 and compiled during a dispute between workers and new management, the dock crews were protesting the installation of coal-fired steam cranes to replace the old hydraulic ones. One worker, identified only as Friedrich M., was quoted, "The old cranes needed no coal and made no smoke. You learned their rhythm, learned when they had strength and when they needed to rest with the tide. The new machines roar all day but break down every week. We are trading a live system for a dead one." A live system for a dead one. That line cut through everything, because that is exactly what was happening. They were replacing something that worked with the natural world, that breathed with it, synchronized with it, with something that fought the sea, demanded constant feeding, and tied the harbor to endless deliveries of fuel. The report dismissed Friedrich as resistant to modernization. His comments were recorded, noted as an obstacle, and ignored. I kept collecting these voices: Kovalevsky, Fabry, Whitmore, Friedrich. Dozens more in footnotes, side remarks, quiet asides. Engineers who discovered old chambers hiding under new foundations. Travelers who heard strange sounds in the stone. Workers who missed the old way the docks moved. None of them had the whole map. None of them knew they were describing fragments of a system that spanned coastlines. Each person only saw their corner of it. One harbor, one set of gates, one strange vibration under the floor. But, together, their testimonies drew a clear outline. People knew. They saw these harbors working. They understood, at least in part, that the docks operated on principles different from the coal-powered world that was replacing them. They noticed that some power did not come from boilers or fuel wagons, but from the rise and fall of the sea itself. And then, one by one, those voices went quiet. Not because they suddenly stopped caring, but because the thing they were describing stopped existing. The systems were dismantled, the chambers were filled, the gates were torn out and sold for scrap. And the people who remembered were told they were wrong, told they were old-fashioned, told they were just nostalgic for a method that never really worked that well anyway. But their words survived, scattered across archives, buried in appendices, hiding in footnotes and diaries, waiting for someone to read them side by side, and realize they were all whispering about the same forgotten machine. The voices told me what existed. They showed me the chambers, the grids, the living harbors. But they did not explain why it all ended. For that, I had to understand 1883 itself. Why that year? What happened? The deeper I looked, the less 1883 felt like a random date, and the more it looked like a hinge, a moment when something fundamental shifted. I started building a timeline, not just of harbor construction, but of everything happening around these ports in the early 1880s. The patterns were unsettling. In 1882, a wave of new maritime safety regulations swept through northern European ports. The wording was almost identical across different countries. Requirements for modernized power systems, mandates for standardized industrial equipment, restrictions on experimental hydraulic works that could not demonstrate continuous reliability. Continuous reliability. That phrase appeared again and again, and it was a trap. Tidal systems are not continuous. They pulse. They obey the rhythm of the moon, not the demands of a 24-hour industrial schedule. By redefining reliable as constant, the regulations quietly disqualified any tide-based power system, no matter how well it worked. It was a neat move. You did not have to write ban tidal harbors. You just had to change the definition of acceptable infrastructure. And then came the money. Investment records showed huge amounts of capital flowing into steam equipment manufacturers in 1882 and 1883. New coal shipping contracts. Loans to port authorities specifically earmarked for conversion to modern steam systems. The funding came from a small constellation of banks and industrial consortiums. I began tracing the board members, the investors, the names that kept appearing on multiple documents. They overlapped heavily. Coal mine owners sat on the boards of shipping companies. Shipping companies owned stakes in steam engine manufacturers. Banks that financed harbor renovations also held major positions in the fuel supply chains. It was a web, and everyone in that web earned more when harbors burned coal instead of harnessing tides. But there was something else, something larger that gave them cover. August of 1883, Krakatoa. The volcano erupted with a force that altered global climate for years. The explosion was heard thousands of miles away. Tsunamis killed tens of thousands of people. Ash circled the planet, painting blood-red sunsets for months. In the aftermath, port authorities across Europe began citing unprecedented tidal disruptions as justification for emergency harbor renovations. I tracked down the reports. They were vague, official, cautious. They mentioned irregular tidal patterns following seismic events and concerns about structural integrity of tide-dependent systems. But when I checked actual tide records from 1883 and 1884, the patterns were normal. There were some anomalies immediately after Krakatoa, small variations, minor timing shifts, but nothing that would threaten well-built stone chambers, nothing that justified what came next. Between late 1883 and 1886, 14 major ports went through rapid emergency modernizations. Tidal chambers were declared unsafe, filled with rubble, sealed. New coal-burning infrastructure was rushed through approval processes that normally took years. The official reason was always safety, protecting cities from unstable tidal systems in an era of seismic uncertainty. But the timing was too perfect. The money was too ready. The replacement systems were installed too quickly. Krakatoa gave them a crisis, and they used it. In a memo from a port authority meeting in Hamburg, dated November of 1883, one engineer objected to abandoning the hydraulic chambers, arguing that they had survived far worse storms and tides in the past. The response, recorded in the minutes, was blunt. The decision has been made at the highest levels. Funding for steam conversion is already allocated. Work begins in spring, regardless of technical objections. The decision has been made at the highest levels. Not by engineers, not by the people who understood how the systems worked, by someone else, people with money, with influence, and with a very specific idea of what harbors should be. I kept finding memos like this, more meetings where technical experts were overruled, more contracts that had been pre-negotiated before any emergency was officially declared. It was not chaos, it was choreography, and 1883 was the pivot point, the moment when they had enough justification, enough fear, enough momentum to push through changes that would have faced serious resistance in calmer times. By 1886, the tidal grid was broken. Not everywhere. Some harbors resisted. Some chambers survived in modified form. But the network was fractured. The synchronized system that might have powered coastal Europe with free, renewable sea energy was dismantled. In its place rose the coal economy, dirtier, more expensive, extremely profitable for those who controlled the fuel. The year the sea changed was never really about nature. It was about money, and they used a volcano to hide what they were doing. Once I knew to watch 1883 as the turning point, the demolition records became impossible to ignore. They were everywhere. Thick folders, neat handwriting, cold, tidy language that almost sounded proud of how thorough it all was. I found stacks of files in municipal archives labeled with phrases like removal of obsolete hydraulic infrastructure, infilling of sub-key chambers for structural stability, conversion of tidal gates to standard dock barriers. The wording was clinical, efficient, but the speed behind those words was what hit me. These were not slow upgrades stretched across generations. They were synchronized demolitions happening almost at once across several countries. Hamburg filled its main tidal chambers in the spring of 1884. Antwerp followed that summer, Rotterdam and Bremen by early 1885. Trieste resisted the longest and finally gave in around 1886, one after another, like dominoes tipping down a coastline. In Antwerp, I found a demolition contract dated March of 1884. It ordered that the chambers beneath the eastern quay be filled with rubble and sealed with concrete, and that all iron gate mechanisms are to be removed and sold for scrap. Sold for scrap. No preservation, no museum, just metal by the weight. A document from Hamburg went further and included an itemized list of what was stripped out: 47 pressure gates, various sizes, 12 flow regulators, cast iron, approximately 340 meters of brass piping, 8 large wheel mechanisms, function unknown. Function unknown. The crews doing the demolition did not even understand what they were tearing apart. They only knew they were paid to remove it. But the most disturbing pattern was not in the rubble. It was in the paper trail that went missing. I began searching for original construction plans for the tidal systems. Not the broad harbor layouts, those survived, but the detailed technical drawings that showed how the chambers connected, how the valves operated, how the system actually breathed with the sea. Those were almost completely gone. I found references to them. A catalog from 1880 listed technical drawings for hydraulic harbor works, volumes through sevenths, in the Hamburg Engineering Archive. When I contacted the archive, those volumes were now marked Lost in Fire, 1887. A fire. How convenient. Elsewhere, I saw the same pattern. Plans destroyed during renovation of archive building in 1889. Drawings, water damage beyond recovery in 1891. Documents transferred to Central Authority in 1885 and never seen again. One archivist in Rotterdam told me they had an entire section of their catalog from the 1870s that now consisted of blank entries, titles with no files attached, not misfiled, not randomly missing, removed. Targeted. By pure accident, I stumbled on one survivor. A partial blueprint for tidal gate mechanisms dated 1879, misclassified as drainage sluice designs, and filed in the wrong section of a Danish archive. The drawing showed an intricate valve system, multiple sealing rings, pressure-responsive elements, automatic closures triggered by water height. This was not crude guesswork. It was precision hydraulic engineering, and almost every trace of it had been systematically wiped away. In a ledger from an engineering firm in Prussia, dated 1885, I found payments for consultation on removal of tidal apparatus from 7 different port authorities. The same firm, the same year, being paid to help dismantle the very systems they had once helped build. One entry had a note scribbled in a different hand. Client insists all related documentation be surrendered as part of contract. No copies to be retained. They were not only demolishing the physical infrastructure, they were buying up and confiscating the knowledge of how it worked. A letter from 1888, written by a retired harbor engineer in Bremen, to a technical journal pushed the point even harder. He was responding to an article praising modern, steam-powered docks. I note with disappointment that your publication makes no mention of the hydraulic systems that preceded these installations. For over a decade, our harbor operated at a fraction of the cost, with greater reliability, using principles that have now been deliberately forgotten. I attempted to submit technical drawings and operational records to your journal for preservation, but was informed they were not of current interest. If this knowledge is lost, we will have erased our own recent past. The journal never printed his letter. I only found it because someone kept the rejection notice clipped to the original. Not of current interest. That was the phrase used to justify letting an entire technology disappear. What made all of this feel truly sinister was that these demolitions were not simply about swapping old machines for new ones. They were designed to make sure the old systems could not be studied, could not be reverse engineered, could not be brought back. In minutes from a Port Authority meeting in 1885, the board discussed whether they should document the tidal chambers before filling them as a historical record. The proposal was voted down. The justification was chillingly straightforward. Preserving outdated methodologies may discourage adoption of modern standards. They were afraid that if people saw how well the old tide-driven systems had worked, they might not want the coal-burning replacements. So they buried them, literally, chambers packed with rubble, gates sealed under concrete, iron mechanisms ripped out and melted down. And then they went after the evidence. Blueprints destroyed, reports mislaid, drawings reclassified until nobody knew what they showed. What survives today are fragments, a few scattered plans, partial descriptions, the stubborn testimonies of engineers who refuse to forget. And beneath modern cities, there are still thousands of tons of stone chambers, capped and stuffed with debris, sitting in the dark like fossils from a different industrial age, an age that worked with the sea instead of against it, an age someone decided we were never meant to remember. I need to be honest with you. At this point in my research, I started to doubt everything. The story I was building, this grand narrative of a suppressed tidal power network, erased by coal interests, suddenly felt too neat, too cinematic. The kind of theory that seems irresistible when you are alone with dusty papers at midnight, but starts to look fragile in daylight. So, I did what I probably should have done much earlier. I brought in a skeptic. His name was Martin Keller, a professor of maritime engineering at a university in the Netherlands. I sent him everything: the photographs, the blueprints, the demolition reports, the journal entries. And I asked him, very simply, to tell me where I was wrong. His reply arrived 3 days later. It was careful, detailed, respectful, and it tore open half of my theory. Hydraulic systems were well known in the 1880s, he wrote. They were used for cranes, elevators, dock gates, but they were always small scale, local. The idea of a continental network synchronized by tidal rhythms is technically fascinating, but logistically implausible. You are talking about coordination across sovereign nations, different languages, competing economic interests. Who would have organized this? He had a point. I did not have a solid answer for who would have designed such a network, or why rival states would cooperate on it. He went on, the chambers you are describing could just as easily be water reservoirs for firefighting, drainage systems for flood control, or simple ballast tanks. You are assuming they were all part of a power system, but many of these ports were in areas prone to storm surge. Sealed chambers make sense as safety infrastructure. That stopped me cold. Because again, he was not wrong. I had been reading every clue through the lens of my own theory. What if I had just been seeing what I wanted to see? So I went back to the evidence and did something I had avoided. I started looking for harbors that did not fit my pattern, and I found them. Le Havre in France, a major port, built in the same era, strong tides. But the construction records clearly show coal-fired steam systems from the very beginning. No hidden tidal chambers, no buried hydraulic networks. Just textbook industrial infrastructure. Copenhagen told a similar story. Modern docks built in the 1870s, fully documented, explicitly steam-based. If there really had been a grand tidal grid, why did these ports not join? I started spotting more cracks. Some of the demolition dates I had lined up so neatly did not match as well as I thought. Hamburg began its conversions in 1884, but Bremen did not start until 1888. Rotterdam had finished most of its work by 1885, while Trieste dragged the process into the 1890s. The sequence was still suspicious, but it was not as perfectly synchronized as I had made it sound in my head. And then there were the blueprints, the missing blueprints that felt so sinister. Martin reminded me that archives in the 1880s were chaos. Fires were common, floods were constant. Documents disappeared every week through simple neglect. You were looking at a 20-year period of rapid urban change, he wrote. Of course records went missing. That is what happens when cities rebuild themselves. I sat with that for days, feeling the narrative come apart. Maybe I had built an intricate myth out of scattered facts. Maybe these were just ordinary harbors with a few unusual design choices, and I had stitched them into a story that never really happened. But then I turned back to the primary sources, the voices, the people who were actually there. Kovalevsky, calling the old channels more sophisticated than anything we could design today. Friedrich, the dock worker, saying the old system was alive, and the new steam cranes were dead. The engineer who described harbors breathing with the sea. These were not modern theorists projecting meaning onto blurred photographs. These were people describing what they saw with their own eyes and felt under their own feet. I sent Martin one more message. I quoted those testimonies and asked him, if these systems did not exist, what were these people talking about? His final reply was shorter. I do not know, and that is what troubles me. Because you are right. Something was there. I cannot prove your continental network, but I also cannot dismiss these accounts. Either multiple engineers across different countries all exaggerated in the same way about the same kinds of systems, or we have lost knowledge of something that actually worked. He ended with this: keep looking, but stay skeptical. The truth is probably somewhere between conventional history and your theory, and that middle ground might be more interesting than either extreme. On that, again, he was right. I do not have proof of a unified Tartarian empire powered by perfectly synchronized tidal harbors. That might be too grand, too clean. but I do have evidence of something more advanced than we are taught, something that worked with natural cycles instead of burning through them, something that was methodically replaced and then methodically forgotten. Maybe it was not a cloak and dagger conspiracy. Maybe it was simply economics, the dull, ruthless logic of profit choosing coal over tides because coal can be owned, taxed, and monopolized. Maybe the truth is simpler and sadder than a giant cover-up, but it is still a truth worth digging for. So, where does that leave us? I have spent months chasing these harbors, tracing their outlines across old maps and brittle blueprints, sitting in cold reading rooms, listening to voices that tried to warn us before they went quiet. And I still cannot give you a clean, satisfying answer. I cannot prove there was a unified Tartarian tidal empire. I cannot show you a master plan, name the architects, or draw a perfectly complete network across a map. But I can show you the holes, the gaps in our story that are too sharp, too consistent, to feel like simple accident. I can show you roughly 17 major harbors, all built in the same narrow decade, all carrying nearly identical hydraulic chambers, positioned exactly where tidal pressure hits its peak. I can point to engineers who wrote about those systems working, workers who ran them, travelers who noticed them without even knowing what they were seeing. I can lay out demolition records that read less like maintenance and more like campaigns. I can show you blueprints that disappear right when they would have been most valuable to keep. I can trace a cluster of decisions made inside a span of roughly 10 years, right as coal interests shoveled money into harbor modernization. Maybe that is not a shadowy conspiracy. Maybe it is simply how power behaves, quietly, systematically, rewriting the past by choosing what gets remembered and what gets allowed to rot. The deeper I went, the more I realized how simple the official story of the industrial age really is. We are told that coal and steam built the modern world, that smoke and fire powered progress, that everything before was crude and clumsy, and everything after was a clear step up. But what if that story is only half finished? What if there was a brief moment when another path stood open, a fragile window when harbors could breathe with the sea instead of burning against it, when energy could be free because it was already there, in the slow, endless rise and fall of water that never stops moving? And what if that path was not abandoned because it failed, but because it worked too well for the wrong kind of people? Now, when I walk along old waterfronts, I see them differently. I notice the stone walls with their forgotten arches right at tide level, the sealed openings beneath bike lanes and parking lots, the suspiciously regular stretches of coastline that were renovated all at once in the late 1880s. I see the bones of something, not a fantasy empire with a name we argue about online, but a system, an infrastructure, a way of thinking about power that treated the ocean as a partner instead of a problem to fence off. And I keep wondering what we buried along with it, because here is the part that haunts me most. We are building tidal power stations again now, modern ones, covered in sensors and computers, branded as cutting-edge green technology. Yet the core idea is exactly the same as those old harbors. Capture the tide, store the pressure, release it as work. We talk about it as if we are inventing something brand new. What if we are just remembering? I do not have all the answers. Maybe I never will. The evidence is scattered. The records were deliberately thinned out. The people who knew are long gone. But I know this much. Every 12 hours the tide comes in. Every 12 hours it goes out. That rhythm is older than empires, older than our borders and our flags, older than the stories we tell about progress. And beneath some cities, in chambers choked with rubble, in channels that no longer flow, behind gates that no longer move, that rhythm is still pressing on the stone. The walls still flex. The pressure still rises and falls. The old system still stirs, faintly, like a heart that has stopped beating but has not quite gone cold. Maybe the empire is gone. Maybe it never had the name we give it now. But each time the sea climbs the quay and then slips away again, the idea of that system moves inside us, reminding us how much of our own past we have not really heard, reminding us that the story of progress is not a straight line from dark to light. Sometimes it is a spiral. Sometimes we move forward by forgetting what we once knew. And sometimes the most radical thing we can do is listen to what the tide is still trying to say, that there was another way, that it worked, that someone chose to make us forget, and that maybe, just maybe, it is not too late to remember. The harbors are still there, under our feet, waiting. All we have to do is look down.